Well, hello, and thank you so much for joining me once again here on the channel. And you can see I'm back in the studio. Now, I've been traveling a fair bit recently, so it's really good to get my feet back here on solid ground. But anyway, today I want to bring you a video which goes through my 4 different methods that I have used over the years to capture nightscape images. Now, some of these you'll relate to, others you'll think, oh, I haven't tried that, maybe I'll give that a go. But that's okay. There's no hard and fast rules about this. I just want to lay it out there. This is what I do. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but I want to try and give you some concrete steps and things that you can actually stand on and hang your hat on and say, yeah, I can do that, or I have done that, or I'd like to try that. So let's get into it. Now, of course, the first and most basic method that there is single shot exposures. And what I'm going to do is show you quite a few images here and just talk you through each one. And I'm going to do that in each of the 4 categories, just to give you a little bit of an understanding. Now, as always, I like to show people as much as I can my mindset and why I'm thinking the way I am when I'm taking particular images. So let's start off with this first shot. And this is entitled Morning Has Broken. Now, this image was shot quite a while ago. And as you can see, it's quite a basic image. There's no foreground lighting at all. All it really is a Milky Way background with a fair bit of liberal post-processing done with colours, etc. But essentially, it's quite a very basic and simple image. It's a single exposure. As you can see the settings there on the screen now. And this was taken pretty close to sunrise, so it was very, very late in the morning. And the Milky Way was setting down in the western sky there. So nothing outstanding about this image at all. The foreground is completely silhouetted, completely black. Now, this next image you can see is at the railway station with a little bit of street lighting hitting the side of the old bluestone building. Now, I really like this image. It is a single exposure, as you can see from the settings on the side there. Now, in the distance, you'll notice there's a light coming towards the camera, and that's actually a train on the railway lines coming towards the railway station. Now, I heard it coming whilst I was at the station. I thought, I've got to grab this and see what I can get. And I really like the light that's coming from the street light on the side of the building. And I also like the alternate light from a little bit of light pollution behind where the train is coming. Overall, it's a really basic image. I didn't do any light painting. I didn't do anything out of the ordinary. I basically just framed it up, focused to infinity, and clicked the shutter. Now, this next shot is not that much different, except I did a little bit of light painting, but it's probably one of the most basic light painting shots you could see. The light is from the left-hand side, and it's just one single exposure once again, with the background shot there at, I think it's a 20-second exposure shutter speed, and you can see the stars have been exposed in that shot, and then there's just that touch of light from the left-hand side just to give you some texture around the rocks. Now, you will know that I love rocks, and any time that I can shoot nightscapes with rocks in the foreground, I'll take that opportunity every single time. So I remember this time I was with a friend of mine, and we were up there shooting different places, and you know, it wasn't a highly technical shoot. It's quite a few years ago now, and I was just basically capturing some pretty basic single exposures, and this is one of the ones from that night. Now, this next shot, you've seen this before. There's a video link to that above here, and this is also a single shot with just a touch of light painting on the front. Now, if you look at this, now you remember a couple of weeks ago I talked about deconstructing images. Now, if you look at these images, you can see which direction the light is actually coming from. So in the background, of course, you've got the tail end of the Milky Way rising in the sky, and then you've got some light pollution coming from the city, which is directly behind this shot. Also, there's a major freeway, so there's a bit of car traffic happening there as well. And just that tiny little bit of side light on the road sign, which makes all the difference. If I didn't have that little bit of light on the road sign, it would just be a black silhouette, and I don't think it would have the same impact. Now, my last image, I've called this Heavens Above, and it's a gorgeous old stone cottage. It's a ruin, and no one's lived in this place for years and years. Once again, it's a single shot with just a little bit of light painting. Now, this particular image is lit from both sides. So in the exposure time that I had, and you can see the settings on the side of the screen there, I had to run from one side of the shot with my torch all the way to the other side to get this image in one exposure. Now, that's fraught with danger because there's all sorts of obstacles and things on the ground that you could trip on. But nevertheless, that's what I did quite a bit of, especially in my early times when I was shooting nightscapes. Now, all of these images I've showed you are quite a few years old. And I guess that sort of gives you a bit of a hint as to my methodology, because back then I was doing most of my images as single shot exposures. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. And to this day, I think that's still a very valid method of shooting nightscapes. But I want to show you that there's more than one method and more than one way of going about it. So now let's have a look at method number 2. Now, method number 2 involves single shot background sky images blended with multiple foreground light painted images. Now, when you look at these, you will notice that there's quite a lot of my images that you've seen in my portfolio over the years that are shot with this method. Now, our first image here, this is one I call the Rumbler. It's this gorgeous old Falcon GT. Well, it's not that old, but it's a beautiful car. This was shot with a 35mm lens. And of course, I shot one single sky shot focused to infinity. Now, all of these are shot the same way and pretty much lit the same way. So what I say about these will be much the same. This was shot at 35mm, background focused to infinity. Then I've refocused. So this is a classic focus stack setting. Refocused on the car, stopped down my aperture, and lowered my ISO. Now, I talk at length about this in a lot of my videos, as you well know. So this has been my standard practice for many, many years now. But in this particular shot, I shot a number of images getting around the sides, left and right of the car. One thing that I say to you many, many times, and I was going to say it again today, is that I never ever light from the angle of the camera. Never do that, because I'm looking for shape, I'm looking for shadow, I'm looking for highlights, and I'm looking for shadows in my images. And of course, I was really happy with how this particular shot came up. Now, our second shot we're looking at here is one I've classified as a sleepy night at the farm. It's a very typical scenario. Now, when I went to scout this location, which I pretty much always do during the daylight, I saw this gorgeous old run-down farmhouse, and I thought this is a perfect example of a light painting subject. So I was able to get my lights all the way around the subject, even inside the building, and light it with my classic fine art light painting method. You can see the settings that I've used on this image on the side there. But the background sky shot is one single exposure, and that's focused at infinity. And then once I've got that exposure the way I want it, I've refocused onto the building and stopped down the aperture, lowered the ISO. Now, this is the key to getting sharp images. It's that lower ISO and the more closed down aperture. Now, the secret to photography is to find the sweet spot of lenses. So I find with nightscape images, generally you've got to shoot wide open to get the stars, or close to wide open with your lens, to get the stars to come out really brightly and have enough exposure without star trailing. But of course, when you're shooting foregrounds, they're not moving. You can spend as much time as you wish lighting and shooting the foregrounds. Therefore, you can close down the apertures. And that is the key to this method of light painting. And you've seen plenty of videos where I'm demonstrating that out in the field. So my next subject here is the Austin truck. Now this, I spent a fair bit of time light painting this, but once again, this is a single background exposure, just one shot of the sky, and then a number of images of the foreground. And this next one, which is the hay elevator, exactly the same thing. So I've lit this all the way around. Now this particular subject was a little bit more difficult to light, only because of all the wires and the spokes, etc., that are around to make up the shape of the machine. But the technique remains the same. And I think it's really important, once you work out the technique and the methods required to shoot these images, then that is half the battle won. Now, our next shot is one of my all-time favourites. I've talked about this one before. This is the Milky Way Shack. This takes me back to a trip. I did a week-long trip over to the Grampians area in Victoria, Australia here, and I absolutely loved this particular location. And you can see a video of that up here in the side of the screen where I went there with a friend of mine, Bailey, and we shot this, once again, a single background image of the sky. Then multiple images of the front, same method. So you can get the gist of what I'm thinking here. There's no complications. When I'm out there shooting, I'm not thinking, oh, how am I going to do this? What's my methodology? No, I've got that locked away. I know exactly what I'm going to do. And it doesn't matter what the subject is. I'm pretty much doing the same thing with all of these images. So, as you can see, the next one here, at the same location as the house, it's the leaning water tank, and it's a simple image. There's not many exposures in this one. Wasn't difficult to light, wasn't difficult to shoot, but it has something special about it. And that's the thing I love about these broken down old farmhouses and these broken down old pieces of machinery. They have charm and they have character, and that's one of the things that I love most about shooting nightscape images. Okay, now we have, this is a little bit different. This is from a night I spent in a cave up on Hollow Mountain at the Grampians. Same trip I was just referring to. And I waited for the Milky Way core to get down in that western sky because I knew that the view at that cave would beautifully line up with the setting Milky Way core. And the image you're looking at right now is that. So I've exposed for the Milky Way core in one shot outside the cave. Now, of course, when I do that, because especially in this shot, it highlights the fact that the cave rock face is going to be a little bit out of focus because I've actually focused on infinity to get the stars. Now, if I tried to do this in one shot, then what I'm going to end up with is, yes, I'm going to have the stars in focus, but the foreground is going to be a little bit blurry and out of focus. That's what happens with single shots. It's hard to get that focus plane all the way through. So in this particular example, what I've done, I've refocused on the rocks, dropped my ISO, close down my aperture, and that of course gets me a beautiful sharp focus on the rock face. Then all I have to do is do the light painting, and this is the resulting image. It's not too bad. Another one of the things that I love to shoot, and here's an example here, is a fence post. Now, a simple fence post. Now, we walk past these items every single day of our life and we think, oh, there's an old wooden fence, who cares? Well, I'll tell you what, I care, because I can see the value in lighting these foregrounds up. They look absolutely gorgeous, and this is another example of that. Even the grass tussocks look good. Fence wire looks good. And why is that? It's because of the angle of light that's coming in. So the lighting is from both sides, sometimes from above, but always off to the side. Once again, one single exposure for the background. Now, the last image I want to show you in this particular method and section is this beautiful old 37 Chev ute in a gully. Now, I did a complete video, and you can see that up here, of this occasion when I shot this and how I lit it and everything else. But I'll briefly go through it again here. We've got one background exposure. So once I've got that one background exposure done and dusted, I know that I have to keep my tripod steady in exactly the same place. I can't move the tripod, because if I do that, any other exposures that I'm going to be taking and adding in won't line up. So it's critical that the tripod is solid and secure. But I can still change the aperture, I can still change the focus, and I can still change the ISO, which I have done here in this example. And you can see the foreground exposures closed down a long way, much lower ISO, sharper image, crisp all the way in. You can zoom right in on the image and still see a very sharp and crisp image. So I hope that makes sense to you. That's my second method of shooting. Now, I've done a lot of nightscapes that way. Now, method number 3 is not very much different to that, with one pretty large exception. So method number 3. Well, recently, probably within the last 12 months or so, I've been doing a lot more stacked sky exposures. So the only real difference between method number 3 and method number 2 is that I'm shooting more images to stack of the night sky. Now, why do I do that? Well, it's pretty obvious that when you take more than one shot, you have the ability with modern software, Sequator for Windows, Starry Landscape Stacker for Mac, to actually blend all of those together and remove noise from the image. That is the number one reason why you would use stacking as opposed to one single exposure. Now, don't get me wrong, one single exposure works pretty well, and you can see from all the images I've showed you, I've printed some of those images really large and they look fantastic. So it's not the be all and end all, but it is another tool that we have at our disposal. So I decided to use that whenever I can. And you know, it doesn't hurt to shoot more than one shot whilst you're out there in the field. That actually leads me to a point that I probably have made in the past, but I'll make it again here. And that is, when you're out shooting nightscapes out in the field, the best thing is for you to have in your mind a mindset of how I'm going to edit these images later on. Because what I used to do years ago, I can remember it clearly, I'd be shooting in hope. I'm thinking, I hope I've got this in focus. I hope I've got a good frame. I hope I've lit it. I hope I've done this. I hope I've done that. And you know, hope's fine, but it doesn't always pan out the way we want it in the editing suite. So once you've got a little bit more experience, you know, okay, I've got to do this or I've got to do that. I've got to frame that a bit different. And so the point I'm making here is take the shots whilst you're in the field, because if you only take one, you've only got one. If you take 10, you might still only use one, but at least you've got those 10 to play with the stacking and just see how it goes. So I want to go through some more images here now. The first one of those is a bridge I took. Now, this little old, gorgeous old stone railway bridge. I did a video about this as well, so you can check that one out if you want to. For this one, I stacked the sky and then did a number of foreground light painted shots. So once again, for the sky, with this method, I'm exposing for the Milky Way for the sky. So I need a wide open aperture, short shutter speed, high ISO. Then when I'm shooting for the foreground, I'm shooting closed down aperture, lower ISO, and the shutter speed, to be absolutely honest with you, is irrelevant. So it can be whatever you want it to be to capture the amount of light that you need to put in. To be honest, it doesn't need to be very long at all. If you only light for 5 seconds, you only need a 5-second shutter speed. You know, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so this is one shot. The next shot I want to show you here is this gorgeous old dead tree on a rocky outcrop. Now, once again, I've got another video for this, so I'm going over a lot of ground that I've covered before, but I'm hoping that you get a feel for why I'm using these various methods. So this tree was shot exactly the same way. Stacked the sky, lit the foreground, side angles, and you can see the resulting image is quite impressive. Very low noise. Now, one of the other advantages, and I haven't mentioned this before, is that people ask me all the time, oh, you're using a 24 megapixel camera. How do you go for blowing up the images, you know, for printing? Well, I'll tell you what, by using these methods, by stacking and blending layered images together, you have extremely high resolution and high detail, low noise images. They blow up massively big without any problem at all. Now, I realise there's still only a 24 megapixel file size, but the clarity is just absolutely amazing. And so I've blown them up quite large. I've showed you some of the images I've done with that before, and I don't have any issue at all with the 24 megapixel files. Our next image here, this would have to be close to one of my favourite ever images. Just the detail that you can get. Now, that's another reason why you would use stacking for noise reduction. You can also get so much detail out of that Milky Way. And you know, there's only so much you can drag out of a single shot before you just get overloaded with noise. But when you start stacking and using multiple images, then you can push the file a lot further. And that's exactly what you're seeing with this one here. And of course, it's one of my favorites. I've got it printed in this beautiful big print at home, and it looks absolutely amazing. And of course, the old Austin. Well, you've seen this one, another one I've done a video about, and same method. Stack the sky and light paint the foreground. Now, this particular one is really basic light painting, to be honest. There's only a very minimal amount of light required to light this little Austin, and I don't want you to think that every shot has to be really overcomplicated and really hard and dozens of shots. You don't need dozens and dozens of shots. All you need is enough shots. And what I mean by that is, if you need to light the front of the car, light the front of the car. You don't necessarily need more than one shot to do that. And the same with the back. And it depends what the subject is. Everything's different. The bigger the subject tends to need more light painted shots, but you'll get used to that. You'll play around with it. What I tend to find is people, when they're experimenting with this, way overshoot. They'll shoot way too many shots, get home and think, well, I've got so many of the same thing, I'll just chuck half of them out. Or what's worse than that is they actually use them all and it looks like the thing is way too bright. You've got to still remember, I said you've got to keep the shadows and the highlights and the dark areas in your shot, because that's where the dynamics of the image are. And we've got one more image here to show you, and this is one that I love this. It's such a simple subject, and the composition is so simple. I love the way that the Milky Way's low down to the ground here. I had the camera almost on the ground to take this shot because this machine is quite low anyway. And of course, the thin layer of cloud that you can see there makes some of the brighter stars bloat. And that actually works really well with my editing methods because it retains a little bit more colour and structure in the constellations, which I really, really like. And of course the foreground there, well, there's not many shots in this. So once again, it's quite minimalistic. But if you looked at the principles around this, you think, oh, gee, that does my head in. How do they do that? You know, it's a matter of just breaking it down into 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, and you've got the thing. Okay, so that's 3 methods I've showed you. There's one more method that I'd like to talk to you about, and that is using a stacked sky, like I've already talked about in this method number 3, but blending that with a long exposure foreground. And what I'm talking about there is ambient lit foreground. Now, I know a lot of you guys will be already doing this, and it's often used when there's moonlight. So particularly a crescent moon is a good time to use this because there's a bit of light there. But you know, the longer exposure you take, and especially a longer exposure at a lower ISO, gives you a cleaner image. The more light you can build into your image, the better, as far as noise and signal to noise ratio is concerned. But of course, when you stack more than one of those images together, the signal to noise ratio goes crazy and you get this beautiful, crisp image, even though there's no light painting at all. So I want to show you a few images here. The first one you can see is when I was down in Tasmania at the Dove Lake boat shed. Now, this is not one of my better images as far as noise reduction is concerned because it was so dark down there and it was so bleak. There was wind and there was rain and it was a pretty bad night, to be honest. And you can see my video that I did of that trip right here. But I still got this shot captured with method number 4, where I've stacked both the sky and the foreground. Now, if I tried this in just one single shot, it would be noise city. It would not be pleasant viewing, I can tell you that. So whilst I was in Tasmania, I went to Lake McIntosh. And this is one of my favourite shots, even though it is so simple in its appearance. And yet I love it. The Southern Cross, you can see there's a thin layer of cloud. Now it was very thin. It was coming in a lot more thicker later in the night. But because of that, it's made those main stars of the Southern Cross bloat a little bit, which makes them stand out. And I absolutely love that. So what I did, I stacked the sky, but I also shot multiple exposures of the foreground and their longer shutter speeds. Now remember what I said to you before, the foreground is not moving, or generally speaking, it's not moving, unless there's water. But even then, it just smooths the water out. And so the foreground, you can shoot longer shutter speeds without worrying about the stars trailing and all this sorts of thing. And then all you simply do is blend them together. And you can see this image is quite clean considering the high ISOs that I was actually using to shoot it. So again, this is from my Tasmanian trip last year. This is Eddystone Lighthouse. And once again, there was no ambient light except the lighthouse itself. And this is another example of doing multiple sky shots and stacking them for noise reduction, and then also multiple foreground shots. And in this case, the foreground went from the camera all the way to the horizon. So it's a big landscape. Again, this is a beautiful image. There's quite low noise, and I'm really pleased with this particular image. It really gives me goosebumps when I remember this trip because it was such an experience for me to be out there all by myself next to this lighthouse with the Milky Way just coming up over the horizon. Absolutely beautiful. One more I want to show you, and this is a shot I've taken quite recently actually. And this is the river flowing around with the Milky Way coming up in the background, and a little bit of light painting. So this image differs from all of the others in this category that I've showed you because there is a little bit of light painting. But generally speaking, it's multiple stacked images of long exposure foreground with no light painting. So what I did with this one, I took the shots of the sky, the multiple images to stack for noise reduction. Then I took multiple images of the foreground and changed the exposure just a little bit, and multiple images to stack. And then, just because I wanted to try something a bit different for this one, I also shot a few shots with just a little bit of light painting. And the reason I've included the light painting in this is because I love the highlights that you get a little bit of highlight on the rocks on the side of the water, or a little bit of highlight with a little bit of grass tussock. And that's what I love about light painting. Now, one thing that you will find with these larger landscapes, you're at the mercy of the light direction. So in other words, you can't control the light direction. It is what it is. You're really only getting pretty dull, flat light. But as soon as you add a little bit of side lighting, like I've done here, then you start to increase the dynamics of the image. So I guess that brings me to what scenarios would you use this stacked foreground and stacked backgrounds? Well, I think there's a few that stand out to me. One is large, expansive landscapes, and that's like I've showed you here. There's been quite a few that have been larger image shots, not close-up intimate objects like some of the others. So larger landscapes where you can't possibly get a torch out there to light up a hill or a mountain or whatever it may be. And this method works really well when you're doing that. Anywhere where you can't get angles to light. For example, you might be perched on the side of a cliff somewhere and you're shooting this waterfall or something, and you just can't get off on an angle because there's a 1,000-foot drop here or something like that. There could be cliffs, there could be the sea could be there could be rocks, there could be rivers. There's all sorts of things, obstacles that get in our way, so we can't actually get to the spot we need to do the light painting. That's probably, in my mind, the time and a place where you would use this method. All right, so there you go. In a nutshell there, I've given you my 4 basic methods of how I think about shooting nightscape images. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have tried all of these methods, and some of you may not have. So my challenge is to give it a go. One thing I want to encourage you with your nightscape shooting is to try something different that you haven't done before. Because what I see dozens and dozens of people shooting nightscapes that never try anything different. They've got a formula. I'm going to use this lens. This is my shutter speed. This is my ISO. And that's what I do for every single shot. And look, I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just saying there's so much more out there. Try and add some dynamics to the shot. Put yourself out there. Now, I realize not all of us are risk takers when it comes to shooting our images, but I just want to encourage you, just take a little step, just a little one step at a time. And my job here, I see my job is to help and encourage you guys to try something new. So thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I've waffled on a lot today, so I hope you got something out of it. And please leave some comments down below. Give me a thumbs up, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week with something else, hopefully awesome. Anyway, look forward to that.